This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Trade agreements and jobs took center stage in last year's presidential campaign. In one of his first acts as president, Donald Trump formally pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. On the campaign trail, he suggested that recent trade agreements were the primary cause of U.S. manufacturing job loss. Have bad trade deals undermined American manufacturing jobs, or are deeper structural changes in technology and the global economy to blame? Our guest today has written a book that offers answers to these questions. Edward Alden is author of Failure to Adjust: How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy. He also holds a day job as Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he spends his time looking at U.S. economic competitiveness, trade policy, and immigration. Ted, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks, Doug. It's good to be here with you.
Well, one of the opening arguments you make in your book is this notion of autarky. And so talk a little bit about what that means and how it played out in the U.S.
Well, I tried to be slightly provocative at the start of the book, saying that back when I was born back in the 1960s, to tell everybody how old I was born into the greatest autarky the world had ever known. And if you actually look at the U.S. economy in the early 1960s, we were astonishingly self-sufficient. It wasn't that the U.S. was a particularly closed economy. We didn't have high import taxes, what they call tariffs. We were happy to buy stuff from the rest of the world. We just made everything better than anyone else. So the way economists measure this, what they call the trade to GDP ratio. So you look at the value of imports and exports compared to the total value of the economy. The United States in the early 1960s was about 10%. Most European economies, the trade to GDP ratio was 30, 40, 50%. Canada was over 30%. Only economies that had similarly small trade to GDP ratios were the Soviet Union and Communist China, which were both actually pursuing autarky as a matter of policy. So I start out that way because I want to show readers how dramatic the changes that came over the next half century were. We've gone from an economy with less than 10% of our economy wrapped up in trade to now well over 30%. So essentially a tripling of the impact of global trade on the U.S. economy over the course of my lifetime. No other economy has experienced that kind of rapid integration outside of China, which has similar sort of rapid opening. So I think most people don't recognize how radically the nature of the U.S. economy has changed in terms of its relationship with the global economy in a pretty short period of time. So that's why I started off on that rather unusual note.
So what were the drivers?
You know, a lot of the drivers are big forces. So, you know, technology, container shipping, which made it a lot less expensive to send stuff from Asia across the Pacific Ocean into the United States. Improvements in communications technology, more recently the internet, where you can now break up what they call supply chains on a global basis. So, you know, I carry around, not to give them an advertisement, but one of these Apple iPhones, right? And it's got components that are made in more than 30 countries, and Apple, you know, coordinates that all through the internet, and stuff is made, and it shows up in the right place on time for assembly. So all of those things have really opened up the world, the growing wealth in the developing countries. So you had these huge pools of labor that kind of came into the global market, China being the biggest example. Millions and millions of people moving from the countryside in China into the city and going to work in factories, making stuff for sale to the United States and Western Europe and other places. So those were really the big drivers. But on top of that, it has been actively encouraged by U.S. policy. Really, since the end of the Second World War, actually even going back earlier than that into the late 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt, the United States has been consistently in favor of global trade liberalization, removing tariffs, eliminating other barriers to trade. So government policy has actively encouraged the expansion of international trade as well.
Well, and not only policy as it pertains to the U.S., but U.S. policy has actively tried to structure that situation in other countries as well.
Oh, very much. I mean, we wanted it to be reciprocal. In fact, the piece of congressional legislation that started all this back in 1934 was called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. And the idea was we, the United States, would lower our trade barriers if other countries did the same. And beginning after the Second World War, there were half a dozen rounds of what are often called the GATT rounds, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was the umbrella organization in which these agreements were negotiated. And they were very much kind of trade-offs. You know, we, the United States, will lower our tariffs on shoes if you lower your tariffs on Hollywood movies, or, you know, you take our aircraft and we'll buy your cars. They were very kind of transactional deals. Over time, they got more and more elaborate. We started to do one-off deals with countries. We did the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement in the late 1980s, and we added in Mexico and made it the NAFTA in the early 1990s. We did a bunch of bilateral agreements with, you know, Chile and Singapore and Australia and Korea. And you mentioned at the outset the Trans-Pacific Partnership was supposed to be a big regional agreement with a dozen Pacific Rim countries. So there have been a lot of different ways in which the U.S. has pursued this "we'll open if you open" trade-off.
Well, you know, as the free trade issue really is framed these days, there are groups that are clearly for it, groups that are clearly against it, and one of the most vociferous opponents in the last election was labor. That wasn't always the case. Talk a little bit about how that evolved.
Well, I mean, it's been the case for quite a long time now. But if you go back far enough, again, to this period where I start the book in the early 1960s, labor was actually strongly pro-trade in the United States. So President Kennedy, 1962, persuades the Congress to pass something called the Trade Expansion Act, which led to what they call the Kennedy round of the GATT negotiations, which was by far the most ambitious one up to that point. It basically cut U.S. tariffs across the board by about a third. Well, his biggest allies in pushing that bill through the Congress were the labor unions. A lot of the U.S. companies, the National Association of Manufacturers, were kind of skeptical. They were a little worried about foreign competition. But the AFL-CIO said, no, it's going to be good for American workers, right? We are the best workers in the world. Our companies are the most competitive. Other countries generally have higher tariffs than we do. So if we negotiate these trade agreements, it'll be a great thing for U.S. workers. That didn't last all that long. You know, within a decade, the unions began to realize that the forces that had been unleashed were much bigger than they'd recognized. That this was the period, when people talk about NAFTA creating the giant sucking sound of jobs going to lower wage Mexico, it began back in the 1960s. RCA moved its television assembly facility from Bloomington, Indiana down to Juarez, Mexico in 1966. So this goes back a long way. At the same time, the Japanese and the Germans, who were recovering from the war, were getting better and better at, you know, making steel, making radios, making televisions, making automobiles. And suddenly imports in the United States were rising. And the labor unions looked at this and they said, stop this, we want to get off. And labor has actually been a fairly consistent opponent of these trade agreements going back all the way to the 1970s. And you heard it loud and clear in this last campaign. What was different, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, was you heard it from the Republican side as well. Labor obviously much more affiliated with the Democrats.
So to what extent did that change in the environment represent just a rise of the rest? I mean, in the period you're talking about, very early on, in that sort of immediate post-war period, there weren't a lot of other industrialized economies that were capable of competing.
Yeah, I think that was, I mean, that was a lot of what was happening. It was the old manufacturing economies that had been brought down by the war in Western Europe and in Japan coming back, but also, you know, what we came to call the newly industrializing economies, the Taiwans, the Koreas, the Singapores, and followed later by China. So that was a lot of it. What the unions objected to, however, not without some reason, was that the rules were getting written in ways that probably made that competition more intense than it otherwise would have been. A lot of the trade rules, for instance, overlooked the things that the Japanese did that really helped their exporters and kept their markets very closed to U.S. exports. The United States, for a lot of reasons, for many years, at least until well into the 80s, kind of looked the other way. Japan was an important ally, neighbor of communist China. We wanted to strengthen the Japanese economy. And yeah, so what if they weren't completely playing by the rules? That upset the labor unions. The tax code was written in ways that really made it pretty beneficial for companies to relocate in places like Mexico. Apart from the lower wages, there were tax benefits from doing so. And so the unions were rightly annoyed at that. Kennedy in the '62 Trade Expansion Act had promised that, look, we know some people are going to lose their jobs as a result of imports. He, in fact, gave a very passionate speech saying, we can't pursue a policy that's in the national interest and then expect a small percentage of our population to bear all the burden for that. And those were the workers who were going to lose their jobs to imports. And so he created a program called Trade Adjustment Assistance, which was supposed to help these workers, retrain them for other occupations, help with their moving expenses they need to move. Program was a disaster from day one. Very, very few workers ended up being eligible for it. So you put all of that together, and the unions really came to believe that they were getting the short end of the stick, not just from these bigger global forces, but from policy as well.
Well, and talk a little bit about that point that sort of touches on that the benefits of trade are broad, but the costs are very narrow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it. We all benefit as consumers. So, I'm sitting here. There's not a stitch of clothing that I am wearing here that was made in this country. A suit comes from Colombia, my tie's from China, my shirt's from Indonesia. I think my shoes are also from China. They're pretty well made, I think anyway, and they're not expensive. So you go back to the early 1970s, the average family in this country spent about 6% of its household budget on clothing. Today, it's about half of that. About 3% of household budgets go to clothing. I mean, anybody who goes to shop, right, they're giving the stuff away. Everything is discounted. So we get high-quality clothing inexpensively as a result of global trade. That's good for all of us. Well, who did that hurt? Yeah, there used to be 1 million plus workers in the United States, a lot of them in the Carolinas, but stretched out across the country, who used to make clothing. They stitched clothing, and you had American-made clothing. Well, most of those jobs have disappeared. All the clothing comes from abroad. So collectively as Americans, we've benefited because we spend less money on clothing and we get nice clothing. But those people who were working in the textile and apparel factories, who got paid wages that were pretty decent for the often small communities they live in, they lost their jobs, and they're probably worse off as a result. So broad benefits, concentrated costs. And you see that played out across the country.
So we're talking about, policy-driven kinds of things where, the rules were set up that just inherently benefited broad swaths of the population, but impacted negatively smaller portions. But what about sort of the non-regulatory side of the story? What other factors were driving this process? I mean, had we had sterling policies all along the way, would those garment workers in Carolina still have their jobs?
It's an interesting question. The only way we could have preserved their jobs was by maintaining very high import barriers. And, of course, we've got a president now, in President Trump, who's making the argument that we should be bringing some of those back. But no, what was driving that was the larger forces. Apparel assembly is very labor intensive. So, if you can get somebody in a poor country to do it for a fraction of what it would cost to do it in the United States, there is an inherent advantage in that. So there's a big logic to that. The only way you're going to resist that logic is through fairly explicitly protectionist policies. And economists will tell you, and I think they're right about this, that collectively that's not the best thing to do. It makes more sense if apparel gets assembled in a poor, lower wage country and shipped to the United States, and we do higher end stuff. We build aircraft, or we make movies, or we make semiconductors, and we sell that stuff. And in fact, if you go back to the Uruguay round trade negotiations, which was the last big round of these GATT negotiations, this was where I kind of came into it as a reporter. I covered the tail end of the Uruguay round negotiations. The core bargain in the Uruguay round negotiations was we, the United States, would cut our tariffs and get rid of our quotas. We actually used to have quotas. You can only sell so much underwear every year to the United States. That existed for a long time. We would get rid of all that if the rest of the world would recognize our intellectual property rights. So drug patents, Hollywood movie rights, copyrights, the intellectual property that goes into, our world-beating companies like Apple and Facebook and Google. That's the trade-off. We'll give you clothing, you give us intellectual property. From the broader perspective of the U.S. economy, that was probably a good deal. But again, from the perspective of those who lost their jobs as a result, not such a good deal.
So clearly then it was inevitable there were going to be losers in this process. So you mentioned sort of the trade adjustment support for those workers. Why didn't it work? You said it was a disaster. What was wrong?
I don't think as a country we have ever been committed to this. And part of it goes back to that history of not being so trade exposed. We never kind of experienced that as a country. One of the things globalization brought was much more rapid dislocation. I think with countries with a longer history of this, if you look at the schemes in Europe, they're far more developed. The OECD does comparative studies on what they call active labor market programs, which are government programs that if you lose your job, they help you retrain for something else. They send you back to school to learn a new skill. The United States spends less as a percentage of its economy on these programs than any of the OECD countries except for Mexico and Chile. That's our company on that. Most of the European countries spend 4, 5, 6 times as much on that. You lose your job in Denmark, and the government sweeps in and provides, income, sends you back to school if it needs to, identifies new job opportunities, retrains you for those new job opportunities. We've never had a tradition of doing that in the United States. Trade adjustment was this sort of compromise. The government wanted to do trade liberalization, and we'll pay off the unions and other opponents by doing trade adjustment assistance. So the program was always defined very narrowly. So, just to give an example, the first 6 years after the program was created, there were 25 petitions filed with the government, covered thousands of workers. None of them was given a dime of support. And the reason was that the way the regulation had been written, it said you have to prove that you lost your job as a result of a specific tariff that was cut in a U.S. trade agreement. And none of those cases perfectly fit that criteria. There's another one I talk about in my book, a television assembly operation in Tennessee, where hundreds of workers lost their jobs when there was flooded Japanese televisions coming in the 1970s. They made components for televisions. And the way the regulation was written, you had to show that you lost your job because of an import of a like product. And the government said, well, televisions are being imported, not parts, and you're making parts. So therefore, that's not a like product, even though they were losing their jobs because the American television assembly companies were going out of business because they couldn't communicate. That kind of stupid stuff happened again and again and again. And so the unions ended up thinking that the program, they ended up calling the program burial insurance, that it did almost nothing for their members who lost jobs.
Well, talk a little bit about, other situations where the net effect for the worker is the same. You're unemployed, but the cause was not something that would have been allowed you to be eligible. So, for example, if technology displaces you, how does that compare to if your job is outsourced?
Yeah, I mean, what the United States has long needed, and Obama administration, President Obama actually in his first budget proposed this, so it's not like people haven't thought about this, is comprehensive worker adjustment assistance, regardless of the cause. I mean, one of the problems with trade adjustment assistance politically is it cements the notion that trade is a big destroyer of jobs. And we know from the research that in manufacturing, most of the jobs that have been lost, it's because of technology. It's because of improving productivity, investments in robotics. As a country, we make more than we ever did before, but we do it with far, far fewer workers. That's a productivity story. But as you say, that the man or woman who loses his job to a robot is every bit as unemployed as one who loses his job to Chinese competition. And it's always been silly to have that kind of distinction in the law. But the United States, for a variety of reasons, has just never been able to develop that sort of comprehensive program. I mean, we have politicians whose primary goal in a lot of cases is cutting taxes. these programs cost money. You know, if you're gonna provide that sort of benefits for workers, it's got to come from somewhere. It's got to come from tax dollars. The politics have just never made it possible for that to happen. But you're right. Logically, there's no distinction. You lose your job, you lose your job. The cause doesn't matter all that much.
So, you know, we talked about the rise of the rest, but there was one country in particular that had a very disruptive impact on that, and that's China. Talk about what China getting into that global trading system really meant.
Yeah, I mean, it had an extraordinary effect, and I think, you know, we're living politically with some of the fallout from it. So you know, we talk about manufacturing jobs. If you look at manufacturing as a share of employment in the United States, the decline has been reasonably steady. We used to have 1 in 4 workers in manufacturing back in the early 70s, 25%. It's kind of declined fairly steadily. Today, it's less than 9%. But it's interesting, if you look at the absolute number of people employed in manufacturing, it was pretty consistent from the 1970s right through the end of the 1990s. Around 17 million manufacturing jobs fell off a cliff roughly in 2001, which is when China joined the World Trade Organization. We saw 6 million manufacturing jobs disappear in the 2000s. And some of those have come back, but most of them not. So there was this enormous hemorrhaging. And economists have done some pretty good research that, again, doesn't say that trade caused all of that. Technology, again, was a big piece of that in the 2000s. But competition from China had a lot to do with it. You know, maybe 2.5 million of those 6 million jobs were lost to Chinese import competition. China has been different for a number of reasons. One, because it's huge. There's just so many workers entering the labor force. Just the scale of Chinese competition far dwarfed what we saw from the Japanese in the 1970s and 1980s. The second thing is, and there's some very good academic research on this recently. Mark Wu out of Harvard has written the best article. The way China structures its economy has just been very hard to contain within global trade rules. You know, a lot of what the Chinese does is not blatantly in violation of World Trade Organization rules, but they structure their economies so that their companies get an enormous amount of government benefits. You know, cheap land, cheap bank loans, you know, loans that never have to be repaid, de facto export subsidies, regulatory restrictions that help their companies and hurt foreign companies. And you see enormous distorting effects. The best example, I wish I had a slide to show it, is steel production. So you go back to 2000, and the United States and China produced about the same amount of steel, about 100 million metric tons. Since that time, Chinese steel production has grown tenfold. It's now over a billion metric tons. U.S. steel production stayed about the same. And a lot of that is because the Chinese government has pumped more and more and more money into steel production. Completely distorted the world steel market. The WTO has never really been able to constrain this. So China is actually, I think, has been an enormous challenge to the whole global trading system because the rules were kind of constructed for Western capitalist economies. And the Chinese are a different sort of economy, and they are a very big, different sort of economy.
So if many of these sort of dislocating forces that have had a negative impact on some portion of the American workforce are likely to just go on regardless of what can be done. If the approach is not to halt those forces, because you probably can't, what are the conversations that aren't happening that should to sort of mitigate it through policy?
Yeah, so I mean, a number of things. I think one on the trade front, I think we're not necessarily going to see another shock like the China shock because they're, you know, as all these developing countries enter the global market, each has had some impact, but there's none as large as China. I mean, India is the only potential one, but India, for a lot of reasons, is just not as open an economy and not likely to get there. So in some respects, in terms of the global shock, we may be past the biggest part of it. A lot of the arguments in my book have to do with the failure by the United States to do enough to compete for its share of the pie. We were really good at writing the rules, but our sort of collective attitude was, let's build the rules and we will succeed. And other countries don't do that. The Chinese don't do that. The Chinese are constantly looking for export advantage within that system of rules. So are the Japanese, so are the Canadians for that matter, so are the Mexicans. They're all trying to play their edge. And because we have in this country a sort of let the market rule attitude, we've never really done that. I mean, the best example of this is what we call the export-import bank, which is a federal government organization. It's never cost the taxpayers a dime, which basically guarantees loans when we sell stuff to poorer countries where the banks aren't going to lend for it. Boeing uses it a lot to sell aircraft in the Middle East and other places where the banks might not lend. The Republicans shut the bank down a year ago. They said, oh, that's government welfare for corporations. Well, the size of the Export-Import Bank compared to other economies, we're much smaller. Other countries do this far more. We don't fight for foreign investment. It was only a few years ago that we actually, at the national level, sent up an effort to attract foreign investment. Other governments do that all the time. They're constantly trying to lure our companies to invest. I can give you a bunch more examples. Corporate tax reform, export promotion. Angela Merkel goes to China all the time to sell German stuff. Our presidents don't do that. We don't fight for our share. So we need to do a lot more of that.
Hopefully Mr. Trump is watching. Ted Alden, thank you so much. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
Thanks.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.